Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. So excited for this topic, business metrics. You're tracking data, but are you using it to improve? I think this is so important to be tracking data and also to use it to improve. So very important to be able to know what you're tracking and know if it's working or not. Obviously, we all want to know that, right? So love to hear from you guys. We have Casey Brothers and Malcolm Felt joining us from Canopy. So they will be sharing all of this information with you today in our presentation. As I mentioned, this is going to be recorded and we'll be sending out the recording to all those who attend and or register. If you do have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A section of Zoom and we will get to them at the end. We'll also be launching 3 poll questions throughout this presentation in case you are needing CPE credits today. So with that, I will hand it over to you both to take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy.
You're welcome.
I'm Casey. Sorry, Malcolm, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Casey. Take it away.
Oh, I was going to say, I have a background in economics, and then I'm one of those typical cases where you major in something that you don't end up doing professionally. I'm a product marketer. But in product marketing, I've done quite a bit of market research and surveys. So for several years now, data has been a fun thing to geek out about. And I know Malcolm feels similarly. We've had many a conversation of the things we're going to discuss today.
For sure.
All right, we'll dive right in. So just to give you an overview, I'm going to follow the concept of, we're going to tell you what we want to tell you, we're going to tell you, and then we'll tell you what we told you. Because there's a lot to unpack with the way, with data in general, and how you approach it. So today we're talking about making your data more actionable, identifying answers you should be looking for in your data, using business metrics to motivate your employees, and learning business metrics you aren't using, but should.
Yeah, and a lot of firms that we work with, they honestly have been doing things the same way for a really long time. And they generally, that way is like, we're going really fast, we're doing the same thing over and over and over. And so it's important to like start the whole journey of like getting into data by really just like slowing down. Obviously your firm has to continue moving. So we're not saying stop doing work, but we're saying like slow down and just think about the processes. Like you've been doing these processes for a really long time, but there are always ways for us to make improvements. And when you're going too fast, it creates a lot of like room for errors, miscommunications, and things like that. And all of those can lead to just like trying to implement data, but then having to like revisit the whole process again at the end of it. So really just like think through the implications. I want you to look at these questions and just think to yourself, like, are we actually capturing all the data we need? If we are, where is it? Sometimes that's in multiple distributed systems. You might have data in your tax prep software. So thinking about ways to actually start pulling that together. Do we really know what we want to do with it? Sometimes you start this journey and you don't know what you want to do with it, but that's part of slowing down, is just being able to think about like, what do we actually want to accomplish and where do we feel like we can improve? And then do you have like time and the right resources dedicated to actually analyzing it and seeing what's going on? And then you have tools in place to visualize it. A lot of people start simple. They use Excel. Sometimes you can graduate a little bit more, and we'll talk about other options as well. And then start thinking more like a scientist as well. A lot of times you'll be like, hey, I wonder what would happen if we improved this area. And then think about like, have a hypothesis and then come into it saying like, here's what we're going to track to prove whether or not that was the case. So think a little bit more of like a scientist and say like, hey, this is our theory and we're going to use data to keep track of that and then be able to say, is this successful or not?
Yeah. I did have a thought as you were going over that, Malcolm, that particularly with the question that we're pointing out about, do you know what to do with your data? If you don't, that's okay, because it's always better to have data, especially historic data, to pull from once you do have an idea of what to do with it, because then you can start to, and maybe I'm getting ahead of us, but you can see some trends and things that maybe you weren't thinking about then, but you've learned, and so on and so forth. So don't let that be a barrier to entry of like, oh, I don't know what to do with my data, so I don't know what to collect. And many of you, in fact, are collecting data just by the nature of the way you interact with your clients. And so we'll get to also data that you may not be collecting in just a couple of slides.
It's a great point, though.
Okay, so speaking of, got to get your data ducks in a row. Asking those questions will then lead to examining the data you do have, and you really need to get your data ducks in a row. There are some data points that are just fundamental in order for you to have great analytics that then help you make data-driven decisions. These are just some of them. Consider where your data is in regards to each of these. So we've got clients, employees, tasks, time, revenue, and services. And Malcolm already pointed out it may be in different systems. Ideally, they're in fewer systems than more. And if you do have some good integrations, that does help alleviate your data problems. But think, can you be collecting more data as it pertains to each of these points? And we'll get into like what we mean by more data on each of those in a second. One of the ways you'll know whether or not your data as it stands today is sufficient is to ask the right questions. But how do you know if you're asking the right question? Every time I've worked on a survey, as I'm analyzing the data, I inevitably wish I had reworded a survey or the answer options, or wish that I had asked a follow-up question. It's just the nature of the way I deal with data. Luckily, the nature of the way you deal with data is different because you have a relationship with the client. I don't have a relationship with the panelists that I use. So you can collect and add data points to your database at almost any time. In most of my survey cases, I deal with panels, like I mentioned. So for each of you, it's just a matter of reaching out to a client or an employee or refining a process internally. Digging so that you can identify the true root cause as illustrated here. These are the 5 whys, I think made famous by Toyota in their production line. But it is a good methodology recommended to help you get to root causes of information that will help you drive change. Here's a quick example of the 5 whys. I'm not a big fan of reading slides, but I am going to read just this one, I promise. So let's say that there are inaccurate financial statements. A way you might get to the underlying issue here is by asking things like, why are the financial statements inaccurate? Oh, well, because there are errors in the data. Why are there errors? Because the staff is not properly trained on data entry. Why is the staff not properly trained? Because there is no formal training process. Why is there no formal training program? Because the company does not have a dedicated training department. Why does the company not have a dedicated training department? Because the company has not recognized the importance of investing in employee development. Whatever that ends up looking like, I will be very honest. ChatGPT helped us identify this fake scenario. In real life, it can be hard to dig deep, or even if you're the one on the receiving end of these questions, to reflect. So I invite you all to, whether you're asking the questions of yourself, or if you have a committee, a board, or someone else that you are asking the questions of, to ask them in a way that will invite an open conversation.
So many of you have been in accounting for a really long time. Like, it might be something you've been doing for years. And it's important to kind of, again, take a step back and think, like, imagine you're just barely starting your first day at your firm. Like, you may not even be familiar with accounting practices. What things would you notice that might be a little bit different than just going through the day-to-day motions? There really aren't any dumb questions when it comes to like looking at ways that we can improve as a firm and like thinking about different metrics that we can be tracking. So it's important to create a safe environment where you can be comfortable with yourself, like really just taking a step back and maybe asking some of those dumb questions, and then also encouraging other team members of the firm to like be comfortable asking questions, be comfortable bringing up things or surfacing potential ideas. So really it's thinking like a child, like coming back from like, hey, like I've been doing this my whole life, I'm a professional, and now we're going to like look at it from a lens of just like, I haven't been doing this forever, and we're going to look for ways to improve. And it does help.
This is a very common approach by consultants. When companies hire consultants from one of the big 4 firms, it is not uncommon that they come in and ask what might seem like obvious questions, because it is human nature to, when we get to a certain level and we are in the know and we want to be the expert, to skip over those and to try and unintentionally sometimes overcomplicate things. So this is a good reminder. Amy, it's time for our first poll question.
All righty, let's get that launched. Which of these firm challenges most keeps you up at night? Inefficient workflow, billing and payment delays, inadequate reporting, or managing multiple systems? We have a little mixture of everything. There you go. Here's the results.
Awesome.
Of course, inefficient workflow took the top.
Yeah.
Like
that honestly doesn't surprise me. That is a whole other webinar that both Malcolm and I could talk lots about. We're pretty passionate about processes and tasks. So we'll keep going on this topic for now.
Yeah. So continuing on and thinking like a child. One of Casey and I's favorite authors or data nerds is the author of Freakonomics, Stephen Dubner and Stephen Levitt. And on one of their episodes, they talked about how when a kid watches a magic trick, essentially like the kids can spot the trick a lot better than an adult can. And I'll read this quote. It says, "There's a sense that when a kid watches a trick, they're asking a question at every second. They are really approaching it with a sort of sense of constant curiosity and a constant sense of trying to understand what's going on. And I feel like their brains are just always wired and awake when they're watching it." And in reality, like we can really implement the same mentality in our firm, not just for yourself, but really at the firm at large, just looking at things in a different way. And we'll talk about the impact of this that this can have on employees in a bit. And then really your data is only as good as you make it. With many different data sources, it can be a difficult task to keep things like clean and keep data flowing. But you can start to just chip away at it, create processes that make it so that people have the ability to put data in a consistent place, or make sure that people are putting the data and those processes are enforced. Really, like you want to set someone at the firm that's really like in charge of enforcing these like data processes and finding ways to simplify it as well. And when those processes are in place and data is flowing, like that's ideal. And if you have a lot of disorganization and data is not flowing, or some people aren't putting data in, other people are, then your data really is only as good as what comes in. So you're not going to get the consistent answers or the accuracy in knowing whether, going back to those like hypotheses, if you're saying like, hey, like I think if we make this tweak, it's going to improve this area of our business, you won't get accurate answers unless the data is clean, which is kind of an obvious thing, but it's something that takes conscious effort to be able to really like make those improvements.
Yeah. I think with clean too, we think of like when data is spread across or in multiple places, and maybe you have misspellings, but there are also things of just employee behaviors and ensuring that you are incentivizing the right behaviors so that everyone is sticking to the same internal procedures, because that contributes a lot to particularly revenue, productivity type data.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we've spent more than not quite half of our time in this webinar talking about preparing your data so that it can be more actionable. That is an indication of just how important that is. You have to slow down to speed up, get your data ducks in a row, and ask the right questions. So let's say you've got your data refined as well as your processes and operations clearly outlined, and the whole firm is following those processes so that you can really get the data you want. Here comes the fun part, getting your answers. So why do we have questions listed here? Because you'll review your data in the context of a question you're asking. Here are just some examples. What things do we do well as a firm? In this instance, you'll need to define the word well or reword your question. But how can we do more of these things? What is my ideal client? Again, you'll need to define what ideal means to you. These are just examples. Do we need to hire or fire or reallocate talent? Sometimes you have the right person on the bus, but they're not in the right seat. As a firm, you need to decide what questions are most important given the context of your firm and your goals. You can ask all the questions in the world, but you probably only have so much resources. So identify the ones that are at the top. We have a customer right now that was looking at his data, and there was a particular profile of client that was causing him to spend more time on them and their work than on other clients. His goal was to earn more money. Kind of obvious, right? Or hopefully obvious. I hope that might be the case for everyone. And that meant he needed to identify the services he wanted to focus on, which he had already done. The employees he needed, again, something he had already done. And then the clients he needed, something he realized he needed to answer. So that was his last question, right? As a result of examining his data in the context of his recent decisions, he decided that he was going to have his clientele consist of physicians and real estate developers, and that was it. So he took measures to finish the work that he had in his pipeline with all of his other clients, and then did not re-engage them, and then only targeted his efforts to expand his business with clients that met those criteria. Amy, on to our next poll question.
All right. Let me launch that right now. How many employees work at your firm? Easy question.
Yeah. You'll see how this relates in a second.
Well, everyone was quick with that one.
I would hope so. Wonderful. Okay, we've got an even spread here.
Yes.
Okay. So depending on the size of your firm, you're going to approach data differently. Because you'll have different amounts of data, but you also might get a little bit more granular the larger you get, right? As you continue working through identifying answers to any questions you have, you should also consider non-traditional accounting metrics. Most, if not all of you, I'm probably preaching to the choir right now, are familiar with these top three: productivity, utilization, and realization. And these are all very, very good. Realization outside of accounting, I feel like I hear about it more in terms of profitability, but same concept, right? Other data points that you should consider are the following, some of which you might not have thought of, or you might not even be familiar with these acronyms. And I believe our next poll question might ask which of these you are familiar with, and you can see we are not defining them. And that's okay, because again, this could be a conversation for another time. We could talk about each of these. I'll give you some rough definitions really quick. But when that poll question comes up, I want you to answer what you understood before I give you these definitions. So NPS is net promoter score. It is the idea of when someone is approached with the opportunity to share you and your services, would they? How likely are they to recommend your business? ENPS is employee net promoter score. So how likely are your employees going to be to recommend that someone come work with them at your firm? Customer satisfaction, often known as CSAT, is just looking at rates of satisfaction within your clientele. ARR is annually recurring revenue. Depending on the way you bill, this could be something that you are doing or could be something that you easily can do. Hourly billing does make it a bit tricky, but not necessarily. CAC is customer acquisition costs. How much does it cost for you to bring in a new client? So you're looking at marketing spend, sales efforts, your website maybe, all those sorts of things. And then LTV stands for lifetime value of a client. These are data points that force you to step back a bit and think more long-term. I'm talking like more than a year. These are data points that are commonly used by tech companies when reporting to investors. Though accounting firms don't operate like tech companies, thinking about your firm like a tech company can have several long-term positive impacts. No longer will you just be viewing your firm's data from one tax season to the next. You'll be thinking about your firm in multiple year increments.
Yeah, and maybe let's dig deeper into NPS as an example. And I know maybe we can circle back around to some of these too after we ask the poll question as well. Because I know that a lot of you are probably wanting to kind of understand and dig deeper. But NPS, as an example, you essentially can set up, you want to time it at a specific point in time. So like maybe at the end of delivering your deliverables. So if you're doing like bookkeeping work at the end of a monthly bookkeeping cycle and you've delivered all the different statements to your clients, you can ask them like, how likely are you to promote, or how likely are you to recommend our firm? And then there's a specific, you can look it up, but there's a specific algorithm that essentially takes like 9s and 10s. So it's a 1 through 10 rating, and 9s and 10s would be promoters. And then anything below 6 would be a like detractor. And anything in between that is just kind of like left out of the analysis. And then you take the average score from that, and you can start to understand like, hey, like, are our clients happy? And then you can also collect a little bit of feedback at the same time. So if somebody selects 1, maybe they weren't happy at all and they would not recommend your firm, you can collect feedback and say like, hey, where did we go wrong? And then use that as a talking point internally to say like, hey, what can we do to improve like the employee, or improve our process and improve the like overall client satisfaction and the experience that they're having at the firm. And making like a lot of those little like changes and just tweaking the way things work across the firm can really start to add up and make a huge impact when it comes to clients being happy, clients being willing to come back year over year or month over month, and then clients being willing to talk about your firm and recommend you to other people. It really does affect the long-term growth of the firm. So we'll come back maybe and talk about a couple of these other ones, if not now, but during the Q&A, I'm sure you all will have questions. So
NPS is also a good way for you to filter who you want to ask referrals, or like what of your, because you don't want a referral from a client who's giving you a rating of 1, because it's highly likely that you'll just get more clients like that. But if you ask your 9s and 10s, hey, do you have anybody you'd like to refer to us? And if you're running some sort of promotion, could be a good approach.
Yeah, or building reviews too. If you're trying to reach out and build like Google reviews, you can identify people that maybe you need to work with to help get them happy. And then you can also identify people that you may want to be like, hey, like go leave us a review in Google and help us like that. Okay. Yeah, so you've identified the data that you want to capture. At this point, you know where it's at. You have questions and your processes are defined. And so you've essentially gone through all the first steps that we've talked about. Now you can really start identifying ways to relate data and start asking those questions. Capacity planning is something that we hear about all the time. There are quite a few different ways that you can approach capacity planning. But you really, like, you can't scratch the surface of capacity if you're not tracking things like budgeting time for projects, if you're not assigning different availability to different staff members, and you're not, or if you're not logging time at all. Maybe you're a flat rate billing firm, which honestly you should all be at least tracking time to the extent that you know what the cost is for each project. But it really takes several different data points to start to get, like, paint a picture of that. So again, making sure that you're collecting it up front is important. Customer segmentation, Casey talked about this a little bit, but if you want to start diving into different clients, dive into the profitability of each client. Try to understand, like, how much time are we spending on this type of client, and like how profitable are they versus like another segment that might take less of our time but is far more profitable. And then we can start to make decisions like, oh, maybe we go have some like targeted marketing campaigns or targeted processes to help us find more clients like this. So a lot of firms do end up specializing in specific types of clients because they've gone through the work to identify and segment their clients, and even to the point where they know, like, hey, like, what's the age of my clients, and like what type of client is what's our firm's ideal client is essentially what you're trying to achieve. And then how can we get more of that type of client? And so really you're just trying to optimize it, and make the data make sense in a lot of ways. So
Yep.
yeah, let's, I don't
Yeah,
know if you have
we're
another thought on that,
actually,
Casey.
I'm gonna tease everyone a little bit. We are very close to publishing an ebook on how to identify your ideal client profile and become a niche. Every time I say that word, I have to say it both ways because I never know exactly the best way to say it. I hear it.
You're not alone.
But we'll be publishing that ebook really soon because it's something that I was seeing a lot coming up in conversations at trade shows I was going to or podcasts I was listening to, when it comes to accounting firms. If you haven't identified a client profile, I highly encourage that. And that resource should be coming in the next month or so. But slicing and dicing your data, to Malcolm's point, is a great way to do that. And if you have data analysis, whether it's in Excel or you have a BI tool or whatever it is, you can start to break down based on tags you might already have, or maybe you do that in this process. But that would definitely be a slowdown to speed up activity, because it takes time, and you either can't do it during tax season, or you have to have a hired individual who's not going to have responsibilities that contribute to the busyness of tax season, because it's heavy work. But it helps you get to a point where you can clearly see the characteristics of a client that is working best for your firm. And based on like what you as an individual, whether you're an owner or a contributor, however that is, what you're best at, and the firm is hiring, the talent in the firm is best at, how you're distributing the work, and the different clients, there's a lot to dig in there. And the thing I would want to stress there too is that when you do start to approach that, you might get this sense of anxiety of, but how can I say no to work that is knocking on my door? And you have to remind yourself of what the data says, of this is not the most profitable client. And the more accounting firms do this, the more you'll see each other referring work out. I know this firm works with this type of an individual with these types of services. Highly recommend them. I know them well, right? And then it'll get passed back and forth based on the things that you decide to focus on within your firm. Major tangent, sorry.
No, great points though. Yeah, I think a lot of firms we talk to, they either have like one person at the firm that's in charge of data, or there's one person where they essentially are the Excel person, like collecting all the data, but then all of the data and all of the questions essentially just like reside with this one singular person, and they don't necessarily take the time to share it out with the firm, or they might share it to partners or share it with like key people. But I think it's important to really foster an environment where like everyone kind of like knows and understands like the data and has a chance to really like step in and like identify areas where the firm can improve. And like something that's unique to the accounting industry is that essentially we all love Excel, and we all essentially can be a little bit of a mini data analyst. Obviously, it's important to assign specific people to that role. We don't necessarily want everyone essentially having to clean up data and run reports, but there are different ways to structure it so that you can share it out and you can make it accessible. You can also use data to help align like employees around like what's driving success at the firm. A lot of firms essentially take this the wrong way, and they want to use data like a hammer to like control like the staff members. And you kind of got to take a lighter approach where it's more of like, hey, like what can we learn from like the data, and what how can we help like improve, and how can we essentially like foster an environment where data doesn't necessarily become such a negative thing, but it becomes a form of like positive motivation. And it's essentially like something that can be talked about on a regular basis, maybe in more of like the one-on-one type conversations. But yeah, those are just a few ways to really make data more accessible at the firm. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to like be super transparent, and you can still decide like what data do I want to like keep closer, and what data do I feel like would be helpful for everyone at the firm to have more access to, so we can all kind of identify and come together as a firm to improve and take things maybe to the next level as far as like the firm's success goes.
Okay, so we've looked at our data, made sure we're capturing data, it's clean, we're incentivizing behaviors internally to make sure that processes and operations are followed. We're sharing that data, we're democratizing that data so that individuals, managers, and staff accountants can see that, can look at their performance. The more you do this, the more you're able to see trends. And trends is where I really start to get excited, where you can see this year versus last year, this month of this year versus last month of last year. And that kind of comparison starts to be really important in accounting, with depending on your firm and the fluctuations you feel with tax season, or maybe you don't have those fluctuations. But it just adds to the context of your data, really is what you need to improve. You can look at numbers, you can see performance, but again, without that context, it lacks a lot of the ability to be a catalyst for good change, progression. So for example, on our marketing team, we recently changed a definition of a key metric. And it was an important part of our growth to redefine this metric, but it's an important piece of information to have as we now compare last year with this year, so that when we are making those comparisons, you got to recognize those things as well. There are times where as you're growing, that you need to make changes and stuff, but that is one instance where when you are comparing, you need to remind yourself of any changes you make. Conversion rates are also a useful tool when examining your data. For example, you can start to look at how many proposals convert to work, a full-on engagement. How many engagements convert to a re-engagement or repeat clients. That starts to get into your LTV, your lifetime value of a client. How are these conversion rates getting better? You can even look at conversion rates by employee, by service, right? By service item. Both of these methods, trends and conversions, help you, or sorry, I'm confusing myself, but help you spot trends. I would almost say that spotting a trend is synonymous with getting an answer. That's how I feel, at least. Sometimes it's an answer to a question you weren't even asking. Particularly with visualization tools, you can see trends easier, and I think have an aha moment, especially if you're not necessarily the one that's doing all of the data digging. Maybe you're on the receiving end of a weekly report. Visualizations and having historic data makes it easier to have an aha moment. Lastly, data is hard to argue with. It helps everyone check their emotions at the door. When collected and analyzed appropriately and accurately, it helps diffuse arguments and tension. You can always move forward with a decision and check in on metrics and see if the change is providing the impact you want. And if it's not, then you can go back. I think also in that regard, it helps save relationships as well. Without tracking, though, there's no way you could pivot as fast as you can in the right direction as when you are tracking and monitoring your data. That's what we've got for you today.
Awesome. Did you want me to lodge the last poll so we can get a gauge as to?
Yeah.
Yes, I forgot about that prompt.
No worries. No worries. That's why I'm here. Did it launch? No, I can't tell. Not letting me launch. Go down a second. Try that again. It's not letting me launch it for some reason. This is weird.
Weird.
It says I launched it already, but I didn't.
Huh. Because it's the one about the non-traditional account.
It's about how do you currently get insights from software at your firm.
Oh.
I have seen a couple questions on some of those other metrics, like the
Oh, I know what I did.
like ENPS.
We
Maybe
go.
we can go back to the other slide and there it goes. I see the
Sorry, I didn't end the other poll apparently.
There you go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, we'll do this poll question real quick, and then we'll start to discuss some of those questions, and I can go back to that slide as well.
And as I mentioned, we do have a Q&A panel for you to be able to add your questions, and we'll gladly answer them for you. So please put your questions in there. Makes it very easy for us to see them. Okay, and the poll. So we have mostly manually exporting data to Excel and running reports. I'm sure you see that a lot.
Yeah. The big thing there, the big pain you're going to be feeling with that is that your data is static. But Excel can be really powerful with, once I've seen accountants do amazing things in Excel and associating sheets and finagling things here and there. And it's unreal to me. But yeah, Malcolm.
I do see a lot of firms too starting to use automated processes to. No, I mean a lot of the different systems have processes of being able to pull data like automatically, and there's different ways to do it. But a lot of firms are implementing BI tools and then setting up more like automated reporting solutions that essentially give them like quick access to data at any point in time. So a lot of times in the heat of tax season, it's hard to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go spend 4 hours like taking all this data and then trying to put it in a spreadsheet and clean it up and then get the actual answer that I want. But if you can set up that type of structure beforehand, then it's easy to be like, oh, I'm going to pull up this BI dashboard, or I'm going to pull up this specific data report and be able to say instantly, this is where we're at as a firm. This is how we're tracking on the work. I know a lot of people said workflow is one of their areas where they're most stressed out about. And a lot of times that means that hey, is stuff slipping through the cracks? Are we behind? A lot of firms have here's when work is ready to work on, we want to be able to deliver it in 12 days. And are we meeting that type of mark? And oftentimes you're just kind of left in the dark as how you're doing it. But if you can set, I guess where I'm trying to go is if you can set a lot of that up beforehand so you're not having to and automate it a little bit, then it does help to make tax season a little bit less stressful, or just like the regular monthly cycles much less stressful. So
We do have a great question, or two questions, I should say, from Amy Walker. She asks, what is a good cadence to share margins with the team? And are there any metrics that should be for management only?
yeah, I would say a lot of firms do like to keep certain metrics for management. Like obviously when it comes to like revenue and profitability and specific metrics around maybe especially when it comes to like cost, like labor costs, there's a lot of things that go into that might be, you may not want everyone at the firm to know how much each person is making. All those types of metrics are definitely like more meant for internal purposes. But it's good to like have a regular cadence. Like often firms will have like a monthly kind of like meeting where everybody kind of gets together, they kind of review how things are going. There's a lot of transparency. Or you can do more of like a shorter weekly sync up where you're kind of on the beginning of the week, you're essentially going to say, hey, this is how we did last week, these are some things that we can improve upon. So it's just getting people used to that regular cadence where you're meeting and you're transparent. But in a lot of ways, it's going to be up to the firm, your firm specifically, on what data you feel comfortable sharing. But I would probably urge you to at least question of like, is there a good reason to keep this data transparent, or is it more helpful to kind of make things a little bit more open and have everybody understand, so that you can start to get people with just like a shared vision of where the firm wants to go. There's shared alignment around the like things that are driving success. I don't know, Casey, if you had anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I highly recommend having you can call this whatever you want, but I've heard it called a scorecard for each employee. Having an easy way for them and their manager to easily go and see their performance on certain metrics, right? And in that case, you can share everything because it's just their dashboard. You can say, hey, here's your revenue from this service item this year compared to last year, especially when you're comparing it to input. Here's how many clients you have this year versus last year. Here's how many clients you have of this level of difficulty. And just helps provide good coaching conversations and good context for them to see their own progression. And hopefully, right, you have a culture of professional development in that regard. But then when it comes to firm-wide and just, firm-wide, so everyone sees, I highly recommend that you share how, as a firm, you are performing on your services. Here's our most profitable, or here's, this is the one that we have the most clients for, those sorts of things, where it's pretty agnostic, but just kind of represents the performance of the firm as a whole. And then as management, there's lots of things that, yes, you would want to just look at individually. Whether you're keeping a pulse on the performance of individuals or you're trying to make big decisions, you then have to find a way to track data and have enough of that data to make that decision together as management, and then provide the context and explanation necessary to the firm. I think giving transparent reasons for those big changes is important. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be sharing that data along the way.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions? Feel free to put them in the Q&A or chat.
Yeah, I saw a
answer
question on ENPS. I think it might be good for us to talk about that one for a second. So like we talked about NPS, which is like asking your clients how important, how likely they are to recommend you. Employee NPS, or ENPS, is similar, and a lot of you all experience the same pain. We hear about it a lot. It's hard to retain good talent. It's hard to find good talent out there, and so you want to make sure that your firm is essentially looking at the team members you have and finding ways to improve. So asking your employees in an anonymous survey, how likely are you to recommend like our firm as a place of work? Like how likely would recommend to a friend our firm as a place to work? And so you'd essentially take the same structure and you can track that and trending over time and say, as management, we can say, hey, this is where we started. And after kind of taking some feedback and implementing different things, this is where we've ended up, and we can see the trend of our ENPS score going up. And that's going to really make a world of difference when it comes to retaining people and also attracting people, because the better environment you can create at the firm, the better it's going to be for everyone involved. And they're going to recommend, if you can get employees to recommend that they like to their friends should work there, essentially it becomes a huge driver in success.
Yeah. One thing that we do at Canopy when we do our ENPS is we are also asked what we want to keep, start, and stop. Yep. And I've loved that. Particularly keep. I feel like people often will ask start and stop, but it's like, oh, but don't change this thing. It's working great. But this also, again, going back to our slide on how data helps take emotion out, there's a lot of emotion regarding employees right now because it's so stinking difficult to A, find new talent, and B, retain. I can't tell you how many news articles we share internally as we're seeing trends in the industry, citing evidences of fewer people going into accounting for an undergraduate degree, fewer people who are in accounting for an undergraduate degree taking an accounting job, people leaving accounting after only 3 or 4 years when, tenure used to be a lot higher, all sorts of things. And so when you can see data, if that's one of the big pains you're feeling and you start doing an ENPS and let's say it's on the lower end and you're getting nervous about people leaving, that's a perfect thing to say, hey, give us the feedback. Let's incorporate it. And it gives you, again, the ability to have data to take out emotion of conversations where you might have committees who are making hard decisions like purchasing new tech. That is another thing that we have seen. We are a tech provider in this industry. And one thing that we have seen is that it's very common for accounting firms to stick with software for a long time, 10-ish years, right? Even without evaluating anything in that period. And so having data in that regard helps to make at least an entry into some of those decisions. Other ones might be remote or hybrid work, another hard decision to make right now. So.
Yes, definitely. All right. Well, I don't think we have any more questions. So did we want to wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for sharing these great insights. I feel like we could all probably do better at data tracking, analyzing, and collecting it and having the processes in place to do it. So definitely very insightful. I know with my marketing hat on, I can think about, especially with marketing, like there's always so much data you can analyze. It's crazy. So I definitely can see how I could help myself as well from that standpoint. And then the NPS score and the ENPS score, that is so important too. And I think we sometimes forget that we need to also care about who works with us, who works for us, besides who we pay who clients that we have, right? But they're just, that score is just as important as our customer score, I think. Like you said, to retrain and attract employees, like that's the only way you can do it, really, is to be able to do that.
I would say you cannot have a high CSAT score, customer satisfaction score, with a low ENPS score.
Yeah.
Highly unlikely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, great nuggets of information. So excited that you were here presenting today. Again, we will share the recording, and if you guys could send over the slides, I'll include that as well in the email recordings, because I know some of those questions are people going to want to, start thinking about and using internally and asking themselves as they start down this path of really analyzing their data. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much, Casey and Malcolm, for being here. I truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for
thank you,
having us.
Amy.
Have a great day, everyone.